Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the dissertation defense of Edgard Delgado. It is an honor and a proud privilege to introduce Edgard today. Edgard is from Nicaragua and now resides in Wisconsin with his family, and his family is here with him today for his defense. Welcome you all to the Whitewater campus. Thanks for joining us. Edgard started his career as a military service member and served in the US Navy. After his service career, he received his bachelor's degree from UW Parkside and also his master's degree from LSU. He has worked in the private and public industry in the management capacity, where he has gotten all his IT expertise, and his dissertation is, the result of his experiences in these settings. Edgard is the regional director in the Division of Employment and Training, which falls under the Department of Workforce Development, DWD, that is, within the state of Wisconsin. So without further ado, please welcome Edgard.
Thank you for that introduction, Dr. Balaji. Good afternoon, everyone. As Dr. Balaji mentioned, my name is Edgard Delgado, and I'd like to thank you all for coming to my dissertation defense. Before we jump into my research, I would like to take some time to acknowledge some important people in the room that helped me throughout this process. First, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to my dissertation committee, starting with my chair, Dr. Balaji. Thank you, Dr. Balaji, for every discussion and time you invested in my research. I am grateful for your expertise and unwavering support throughout my dissertation journey. Thank you. To my committee members, Dr. Adi and Dr. Andy, thank you as well for your expertise and guidance that helped shape my dissertation. To Dr. Praveen, since day one, you and the faculty at UW-Whitewater have been amazing. I would like to wish you, the faculty, and the DBA program continued success. And one last thing, let's go FC Barcelona. To cohort 7, my extended family, thank you so much for the memories at UW-Whitewater. I cannot wait to see you all again. I would also like to dedicate this dissertation to my family, to my parents, Rosa and Edgard, to my siblings, Anna and Oscar, to my kids, Naeli, Anthony, and Graciela, and to my mother-in-law, Cheryl, and to my lovely wife, Amanda. I love you all, and thank you so much for your support as well. All right, now without further ado, I would like to talk to you all this afternoon about my research. My dissertation is titled, Exploring Technology Inertia and the Continued Use of Legacy Systems in Public Agencies. This afternoon, we will take a deep dive into my research, and I will explain why the topic of inertia and legacy systems are important to me. But before we begin into that, I wanted to share with you all the table of contents, which structures how the rest of this afternoon will go. We'll start off discussing my introduction to the dissertation, and my dissertation consists of 2 essays. So we'll discuss essay 1, which is titled, Is it Time to Move On? An Exploratory Study of Technology Inertia and the Adoption of Innovative Technology in a Government Agency. We will then discuss the literature review, what has happened in the literature so far with these topics. Along with that, we'll move on to the research gaps and questions, the theoretical framework, the methods, and the case study analysis. We will then move on to essay number 2, which we draw from the inertia theory to explore legacy information systems used in public sector agencies, the influence of technology inertia on organizational effectiveness and innovation. Similarly, it follows the same structure. We'll discuss the literature review. We'll have some research questions, the research model. We'll go over the hypothesis development, the methods, and the results. Along with that, we'll have some implications for research and practice, and then the conclusion to my dissertation. So, I would like to start off my dissertation with a question, okay? Can you imagine a world where in today's business environment, businesses are using floppy disk and typewriters to complete modern business functions? If you look at these things, at some point, these were modern solutions, okay? But over time, we have seen these modern solutions become less relevant, and essentially, they become obsolete. Part of the reason why they become obsolete is because these practices over time, become outdated, and modern practices and technologies are available to assist organizations with the business demands of today. And to be quite honest with you all, this is what happens when organizations do not evolve. So let me tell you guys, in an ideal world, what I just mentioned would be logical. But in reality, not all businesses evolve their practices, okay? When I started working in the private sector, I had the opportunity to manage a team that had used information systems for their daily operational use. Later on in my career, I'll find out that the system that we had been using had been around in the organization for almost 30 years, okay? And I would also find out that these systems were called legacy information systems, okay? And let me tell you, as a young manager entering the industry, I was puzzled. Why are we calling these things legacy systems? Didn't quite understand it. But over the next 10 years, I fully understood why, okay? Legacy systems, to break it in a nutshell, are basically outdated hardware and softwares that have been part of the organization for a long period of time. And they continue to be the backbone of the operations, okay? This being said, I am positive that many of you have used a legacy systems in your careers, okay? And the reason I say that is because they come in many shapes and sizes. For example, if you enter your timesheets, they're called human resource management systems, okay? If you have a student and you're entering grades, most likely that's a case management system. If you're entering revenue and transaction records, most likely you're using an enterprise resource planning system, an ERP. And what happens is that, kind of like myself, when I entered the industry, I started to notice that these were just information systems. But what happens is that, in reality, over time, these systems, due to their age with their organization, lose their effectiveness, okay? They have limitations, they need a lot of resources to support them, and they are constantly down for maintenance, okay? If you're still not familiar with legacy systems, I'll give you another hint. Most likely, you have received an email throughout your workday saying that the system will be down for maintenance, okay? So, again, as a young manager, I asked myself, today we talk about cutting-edge technology. Why are we using legacy systems when modern solutions exist, okay? As soon as I left the private sector and went on to the public sector, I got hired in the public sector, and I said to myself, the government has to have it figured out, okay? At least that's what I thought. Because in some aspects, I've read that they have electronic government efforts, and they're basically evolving their efforts to help their clientele, okay? But when I started working there, it was a whole different story. Externally, it was true. They were making efforts to expand their services to their clients. Internally, all the operations were dominated by legacy information systems, okay? So I asked myself, and I've heard it from others, so what's wrong, Edgard, with keeping a system for that long? Well, as you all know, the folks that implemented the system are most likely no longer there in the organization, okay? They have moved on. And what that means that critical knowledge has been lost, okay? Also, there has not been a true understanding of that system's capacity. And again, over time, these systems become less flexible, and you are not able to modify them. And eventually, the organization has to give in and move on from these legacy systems, okay? So, when I started to read the literature, I was not surprised to see that some of these legacy systems are high costly, because they do cost a lot of money. As a matter of fact, a report by the GAO basically states that federal funds and the government, at least 60% of those funds go to maintaining legacy systems. So they are very expensive. Along with that, they have integration issues. I have seen it firsthand where you want to implement a system, or you want to discontinue a system, and you want to implement a new system, and you just can't. So I've seen organizations actually now have two systems running in parallels because they cannot get rid of the older system. A lot of the time, that has to do with data, okay? And research also says that they are limited in flexibility. They lose data, as I mentioned before. They start having performance issues and security concerns because they're so old. Most likely they'll need to be updated. And at the end of the day, they lose their ease of use, okay? And when trying to tie back the actions of inaction, I found the inertia theory, okay? Where organizations use traditional resources to combat the business demands of today. Okay? And what happens in that literature, what it basically says is that organizations like to remain in their routine practices. They like to have the same problem-solving strategies as they did yesterday, for today, and for tomorrow, and in the future. Along with that, they're not flexible with their resources. Because organizations know one thing: if it's not broke, don't fix it. Okay? So they remain in their course. But studies have actually said that if organizations actually implement modern information systems the right way, it will help them facilitate the business functions. Okay? So that's where my study comes through. Why? The question is why? Why are organizations depending on resource-intensive legacy systems, especially knowing that there are modernized solutions that can actually assist them? Okay? And also, why are managers comfortable using these systems, and what do they think about them? So here's an overview of the both essays that we'll be going over, okay? And essay 1, as I mentioned, is titled, "Is it Time to Move On? An Exploratory Study of Technology Inertia and the Adoption of Innovative Technology in a Government Agency." So in this study, we do an exploratory study, and we do it with an agreement with the local public agency to provide insights into the barriers that exist when it comes to adopting newer technology, which actually results in continuing to use legacy systems, okay? So therefore, we also use the TOL framework, which actually has been used in literature and other studies to try to understand what technological, organizational, and environmental factors exist that could lead to adoption, okay? And last thing I want to share with you all on that essay is that key stakeholders were interviewed, and the interview lasted close to 60 minutes, okay? With essay 2, we draw on the inertia theory to discuss legacy information system used in public sector agencies, the influence of technology inertia on organizational effectiveness and innovativeness. And we perform a cross-sectional study and explore the relationship between inertia, organizational learning, change management towards organizational effectiveness, and innovativeness within public agencies. So as I mentioned, this is essay 1. It's titled, "Is it Time to Move On? An Exploratory Study of Technology Inertia and the Adoption of Innovative Technology in the Government Agency." And here's the literature review. So the literature review, what it does is that it tells you a story of what's actually happened in previous studies, okay? So the inertia theory, one of its earliest publications basically state that current processes are no longer practical, and technology can assist in the production of commodities in the United States. So in 1934, this was still an issue, okay? Where inertia needed some type of technology to assist it to break, okay? Later on, it does a cameo in the physics domain, okay? It talks about being predictable in its track record, resist to change, and also remaining motionless to protect itself, okay? Looking at the management literature, because it does make itself into the management literature, one of the things that it mentions is that when it comes to knowledge inertia, okay, organizations are used to having routine problem-solving strategies to meet the business demands of today, which does not allow for any changes. It also discusses that organizations are not flexible with their routines, and they're also not flexible with the resources, which again leads to no change. Okay? When discussing organizational inertia, it talks about the inability to make any significant internal changes, regardless of whatever external influences exist. Okay? It talks about organizations staying on with embedded practices, not understanding what's actually beneficial to them, and continuing in their track record. Along with that, resources remain unchanged, and due to all of this, there is no innovation, almost little to none. Okay? And we use the TOE framework because we wanted to understand at what point or what are the factors that lead to adoption when we are considering the technological, organizational, and environmental considerations that could lead to the adoption of new technology. Okay? Literature basically states that when it talks about technology, it talks about what is available for firms, externally and internally. What are the characteristics of technology? Along with that, when it talks about the organizational factors, what does top management support the initiative? Okay? And also what resources are currently available, along with the communication structure. Is there communication within the organizations to actually move forward? And the last thing is the environmental factors, which discusses external pressures and competition intensity. Okay? So as I'm looking at the literature, I notice that the literature discusses a lot of different items here. Okay? When discussing legacy information systems, it discusses the modernization piece. Okay? It discusses that organizations are always having issues and problems. But it doesn't discuss what is the perception of continued use. Along with that, when looking at the inertia studies, I noticed that there was a limited amount of literature that is available in the field of information systems concerning inertia and its effects. In some aspects, I did notice that in the knowledge management literature, there is a positive notion to inertia. Okay? It captures knowledge. And in an innovative study, it discusses that inertia has a negative notion. It doesn't allow for change. Considering that this is targeting the public sector, okay, we also wanted to understand the research gaps in the public sector. One of the things that's up and coming and has been discussed a lot is the new public management. Basically, private sector practices need to be injected into public sector organizations in order for them to succeed. Also, as I mentioned earlier, electronic government efforts. It discusses that governments are making different headways to make sure that they are reaching out to their public and they are doing it in an electronic form. Okay? So my research questions for this essay is, what are the critical factors regarding technology, organization, and environment that drive governments and agencies to innovate? Okay? And is it possible for the management team and government agencies to stimulate innovative practices despite bureaucratic constraints? And here's my methods and how I obtain primary data. First, I want to say that, and I want to share with you all in the way that I selected the organization. I selected a local public agency, and part of the reason why they were selected is because they had just gone through a modernization project where one of its legacy systems failed, and it hindered the operations during the pandemic. Okay? The sample design, as it states on there, is a case study. And as we know, we perform case studies because previous studies have determined that they are executed with the consideration of attempting to understand the how and why things happen. Okay? We also, because we selected the managers in this case, it becomes a convenience sample, which means that the participants of the study met certain practical criteria and they were easily accessible. Okay? And here's the research design. I went ahead and had face-to-face interviews with these folks, okay? The semi-structured questions that they were asked were all based on the literature review from the TOE framework. The members of management needed to meet some requirements. The first one is that they needed to understand the characteristics of legacy systems. And the second was that they needed to be in a management position for at least a year. Part of the reason why I chose the management team is because at the very end, they are still able to make some decisions, right? So that's the reason that we focus on managers here. The procedure was basically that the management team was invited through an email. After they would agree, we will set up a date to conduct the interview, and then we will record the interview with an electronic device. After the interview, we will go ahead and transcribe the interview details to Microsoft Word, okay? And here are the participant details. So first, I want to let you all know that most of them had over 10 years of experience, okay? One of them was an executive director, 2 were managers, 2 of them were regional directors, and 1 was a district director. And it took me over a month to do this study, okay? As you can see, I started around April 25th and ended on May 26th. And the length of the interview, in some cases, they were a little bit less than 60 minutes, but in others, they were longer. Part of the reason why is because I had follow-up questions. So for example, I wanted to ask more questions. One of the regional directors that was actually there for over 10 years, that was her recurring time, meaning that she had actually left the position and came back. So overall, she had almost 20 years, and she understood what was happening within the agency. So I asked a lot of follow-up questions to try to understand the historical issues that have been going on. And here is my findings, okay? I want to share with you all the TOE framework and also the findings. And I want to tie it back to the TOE framework, okay? So when looking at technology, one of the things that was interesting that managers mentioned was that legacy systems that are being used today are not fully understood. And because of this, they have created super users. So I asked, what does that actually mean, okay? Because I don't understand what a super user is. So they said that super users are folks that they can depend on, and they've depended on for a very long time to understand what the system can and can't do, and they've learned those functions via trial and error, okay? Because there is no operating standard procedure. So that's how they've learned. And they're categorized as super users, and later on I found out that they had an actual email to ask them questions, like an actual email group, okay? Because they're the experts here. Also, one of the managers says, hey, look, Edgard, the federal system doesn't really rely on us to provide them, to give numbers out there, but at the very least, the numbers that we're giving them are actually reliable. So at the very least, the legacy systems that we're using are at providing reliable results, okay? They knew that was still an issue though, because at some point, if the federal government wanted to go ahead and start auditing based on performance metrics, that's an issue, okay? When discussing organizational factors, management had many ideas on how to improve the system or recommendations of what systems could be used based on their experience, but they lose interest because a lot of the times they've mentioned that the budgeting that's needed for these systems are tied to legislation. So sometimes to make a systematic change requires that type of effect, okay? Also, management does not participate in discussions that relate to innovative solutions. So there is no communication discussing we need to move forward. Some of them said that that's actually the federal side's fault, because if they're not asking for reliable numbers, why do we need to engage in communications, okay, that lead to innovative solutions if what we're submitting today is actually practical? When it comes to environmental factors, many of them said that modern technology and governments are only adopted when it becomes a hot ticket item. Okay? For example, the pandemic. As I mentioned, they had just gone through a modernization project, and part of the reason why they went through that is because the pandemic failed the operations and many folks were left without benefits. Okay? Along with that, many also said that the public pressure, not legislation, makes them evolve their practice, which is actually interesting. Okay? Going back to the pandemic, as we all know, when the pandemic hit, the CARES Act was signed on March 25th, 2020. Many of them actually said that based on this legislation, okay, organizations knew that they had a system within their operations for 50 years, but when this legislation came out, it actually asked agencies to make systematic changes, like increasing weeks in benefits, like increasing the total amount that folks would be receiving. So the legislation actually brought forth problems that they knew they had for a very long time. Okay? So that concludes essay number 1, and I'll move on to essay number 2. Essay number 2 is called Legacy Information System Using Public Sector Agencies, the Influence of Technology Inertia on Organizational Effectiveness and Innovation. And in this study, we actually perform a cross-sectional survey to try to see and understand what do managers perceive inertia, change management, and what are the actual relationships between these constructs. Again, we'll do a literature review in the inertia theory. As I discussed earlier, the inertia theory always has the same definition, meaning that is an object that remains fixed in its position. Okay? When looking at inertia in an organizational setting, it discusses that in order for inertia to make some changes, right, we have to fully understand what inertia can actually contribute to. Okay? Respective studies have applied that inertia concept to strategic management, and the logic management is actually moderately explored. Okay? And past studies within organizations have actually identified that inertia, when it comes to organizations, they continue to use routine problem-solving strategies based on past experiences. So they use traditional resources to combat the business demands of today. Okay? When discussing change management theory, this is a new notion that we're bringing to the table. When discussing change management theory, it discusses how organizations adjust their operations to continue to meet the demands of the business. Okay? It discusses that at times, these transformations can come from upper management. Okay? The transitions, the transformations, the changes that actually occur may come from different levels of management. There's also studies that state that change management is actually really difficult. Many times, when organizations try to implement change management, they fail. So there's actually studies out there that discuss different steps that could be adopted in order for change management to be successful within organizations. When discussing organizational learning theory, again, it's a new construct that we introduced based on this study. It discusses the capability of an organization to understand not just current, but also latest information, okay? A lot of this information exists within the organization, so it could be stored knowledge, knowledge distribution, acquisition. And for this study, we're actually looking at the learning orientation, okay? Which includes the commitment to learn. Studies in commitment to learn basically state that organizations are interested to learn to make themselves effective and innovative. Same thing with open-mindedness. Members of the organization, okay, want to bring new forth ideas. They want to move forward. So they have to have an open mind in order to innovate and learn, okay? And same thing with shared vision. Most of the time it discusses that members of the organization must have the same shared vision in order to move forward. And how do you do that? By learning what you currently have, okay? When looking at organizational effectiveness, it discusses how well the organization is doing. At the organizational level, it discusses net profit, okay? Yearly revenues. When discussing it at the employee level, it discusses job satisfaction, employee engagement. Moving on to innovativeness. Literature in innovativeness discusses that innovation is usually led by introducing new products and services, okay? Previous studies have actually argued, and this was actually really interesting when I was reading this, previous studies have actually argued that the only way that firms are able to innovate is by understanding their competencies that generate value to the firm, okay? But as literature goes, despite the abundance of innovation, right, the studies on innovation, the question on how organizations innovate still remains. So here are my research questions. First one is, what are the influences of technology inertia on organizational effectiveness and innovation? The second, does organizational learning mediate the relationship between technology inertia, organizational effectiveness, and innovation? And the third is, does propensity to change moderate the relationship between inertia, organizational effectiveness, and innovativeness? And here's my research model. I'd like to provide you guys an overview of my research model, and I will be going into my research model in detail, discussing the hypothesis development, okay? So first, you guys don't have to memorize this, because I'll have it here in these slides coming up. This is the first hypothesis. There will be a direct negative relationship between technology inertia and organizational effectiveness, okay? My second hypothesis in this study is that technology inertia will negatively and positively influence organizational innovativeness. The third, which is the learning orientation, is that technology inertia will have a negative and positive influence on organizational learning, commitment to learn, open-mindedness, and shared vision. The fourth is that organizational learning will have a positive influence on organizational effectiveness, and organizational learning will have a positive influence on organizational innovativeness. Here's the fifth hypothesis. Organizational learning will mediate the relationship between technology inertia and organizational effectiveness. And 5B is that organizational learning will mediate the relationship between technology inertia and organizational innovativeness. And the moderator here is propensity to change, which is a dimension of change management. And the sixth hypothesis is that propensity to change will positively moderate the relationship between technology inertia and organizational effectiveness. And in 6B, propensity to change will positively moderate the relationship between technology inertia and organizational innovativeness. And this is how I want to share with you all my method, okay? This is how I received primary data. So first, we executed a cross-sectional survey. And participants in this study responded to 5 scales. They responded to technology inertia, organizational learning, change management, organizational effectiveness, and innovativeness. All of these scales were adapted from previous studies, okay? The unit of analysis was at the organizational level. We wanted to target managers, entry, mid, and seniors, directors, and executives. So again, the target audience was management and public sector agencies, and the collection of data was actually administered through sentiment. Part of the reason why sentiment was selected is because I had recently noticed that their collection of data was actually accepted into a graded journal. Okay. Managers in this study needed to meet two requirements again. They currently needed to use a legacy system for their operations, and they currently needed to be a manager in the public sector. According to SOPR 2023, on 7 predictions, to perform this study, you only needed 103 participants. Okay? To perform the data analysis, we use Smart PLS, we use the bootstrapping method, and the path analysis regression. And here are the characteristics of these sample respondents. Okay? There were 505 survey attempts. Out of the 505 survey attempts, only 211 were allowed to be part of the research. Okay? When looking at the characteristics, the gender, the female and male are almost split, 49 to 51%. Looking at education, 40% of the participants have a master's degree, 38% of them had a bachelor's degree. When looking at what sector they worked at, 41% of them worked in the federal government, 25% of them worked in state employees. Okay? When looking at how much years commitment they had within their organizations, 35% had 20 or more years working in the public sector. And when looking at the management characteristic, 47% were middle managers, and 29% were senior managers. Okay? And here is the first analysis I want to share with you all. So the reliability and validity analysis, we'll start with the reliability. The Cronbach's alpha and composite reliability measures the degree to which we want to understand when the contracts are reliable. Okay? For our research, our range was from 0.807 to 0.945, which exceeds the recommended threshold of 0.7. So therefore, we have reliability in this study. Okay? The average variance extracted measures the degree to which a construct explained the variance of its indicators. Our range for this was 0.641 to 0.790, which exceeds the critical value of 0.5. Therefore, we have convergent validity. When looking at the construct estimates, okay, I want to remind you all that the results were from a 7-point Likert scale. So if you look at the means between 4 and 5, that's actually right there in the middle, which tells me that those are actually healthy means. When looking at the standard deviation and telling us how spread out our data is, okay, most of our construct had a deviation of 1 and none exceed 2, which means that in normal distribution, the data results are pretty close to the mean. Okay? When looking at the discriminant validity, which discriminant validity is the extent to which measures of different constructs are distinct and not highly correlated to others, if we look at the correlation table, there are low correlations among many of these constructs. Therefore, we have discriminant validity. Okay? And here are the results. First, I'll discuss and explain what standard betas are, along with t-values. So the closer, one of the things to remember is that for standard betas, the closer the coefficients are to 1 or -1, the stronger the relationship. Okay? When discussing t-values, the acceptable range are above 1.96 and lower than 1.96 to be significant, meaning that on the positive side is 1.96, okay? And then on the negative side, it needs to be lower. So 1.97, 8, etc. Okay? So the higher the t-value, the greater the confidence we have in the coefficient as a predictor. When looking at the results, if you guys recall, that my first hypothesis was there will be a direct negative relationship between technology inertia and organizational effectiveness. Those results are not supported, okay? Which is interesting because literature states that inertia allows for organizations to remain with the same resources over and over again, okay? And in today's business landscape, we all understand that in order to be competitive, we need to modernize, okay? For hypothesis 2, technology inertia will negatively and positively influence organizational innovativeness. When looking at that, the hypothesis 2 is also not supported, okay? Which again, it's interesting because previous research has stated that inertia allows for knowledge to be captured, and that knowledge actually allows for gaps to be filled, and also essentially in the future for it to lead to innovation, okay? I'm sorry. When looking at hypothesis 3, technology inertia will have a negative and positive influence on organizational learning, commitment to learn, open-mindedness, and shared vision, okay? All of those were supported. The standard betas were 3.31. I'm sorry, the ranges is 0.224 all the way to 0.31. You look at the t-values, they're over 1.96, and all the results are supported, okay? When looking at hypothesis 4, which was organizational learning will have a positive influence on organizational effectiveness, okay? We see that all of those results are also supported, okay? Now, when looking at organizational learning will have a positive influence on organizational innovativeness, okay? One of the things that I actually was surprised by was that when we're looking at commitment to learn, to organizational innovativeness, it was not supported. Where in previous research, it states that organizations want to learn to remain effective and use that effectiveness to essentially lead to innovativeness, okay? Looking at hypothesis 5, organizational learning will mediate the relationship between technology inertia and organizational effectiveness. And also, organizational learning will mediate the relationship between technology inertia and organizational innovativeness. We see that organizational learning does mediate the relationship between technology inertia, organizational effectiveness, and innovativeness, okay? And lastly, when looking at hypothesis number 6, where we posit that propensity to change will positively moderate the relationship between technology inertia and organizational effectiveness, such that the relationship between inertia and organizational effectiveness will be stronger when change management levels are high rather than low. Both for effectiveness and innovativeness, they were not supported, okay? Which also is interesting because literature in change management states that in order to capitalize where you need to change, you need to understand the routine practices. And management needs to come in with fresh ideas, and the only way that they initiate those ideas are by understanding the competencies that exist within the organization, okay? So here's my impact of my research. So my implications for research first, we extended inertia to a technology context, okay? And we also found that technology inertia has a positive influence on organizational learning. For future studies, I would suggest that we look into when and how technology inertia can influence learning. Along with that, organizational learning mediated the relationship between technology inertia and organizational effectiveness and innovativeness. Future research should focus on other mediators such as system readiness, perceived ease of use, and usefulness, okay? In practice, what we saw is that legacy systems did not have a relationship with organizational outcomes, which is actually interesting as I work in the public sector, and I'm always told, you're new, Edgard, you will never understand. This is the best way to do things, okay? So practice and this study, again, have to look into it a little bit more. But I believe that future research should also perform a longitudinal study to understand the effectiveness and the cost of legacy information systems, okay? Along with that, internal knowledge should be captured to identify current systems' capacities. I think that goes back to inertia having a positive influence with organizational learning. This being said, inert practices should be capitalized, okay? And this is my dissertation conclusion. So in essay 1, we performed a case study where we went ahead, utilized the TOE framework, and we interviewed key stakeholders. The findings here basically tell us that current technology is not fully understood within the local public agency. Environmental factors were deeply discussed as the main culprit to adopting modern solutions. And organizational factors have disengaged members of the organization, okay? In essay 2, we perform a cross-sectional survey. Management was the target audience. We use a third party to collect data. We found out that inertia has a positive influence on organizational learning, and organizational learning mediates the relationship between technology inertia, organizational effectiveness, and innovativeness. And I just want to say that, part of the reason why this study is really important is because today we always discuss the cutting edge of technology, artificial intelligence, and algorithms. But yet today, we're still using floppy disks and typewriters to perform our business functions. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Edgard. So I'll start off the questions now, followed by Adi, and then Andy will take over. And then we'll open it up to the audience to ask questions. So wonderful presentation. Thanks for sharing your dissertation with us. I just had a few things to ask you. So just for the sake of the audience, just to clarify, right? So when you state negatively and positively, you're just simply saying that you cannot decide which way it'll go, right? That particular hypothesis, because the literature says one way or the other, right?
Correct. So the literature in inertia basically has found that inertia can have a positive effect and also a negative notion. And again, in a positive angle, Liao 2002 basically states that inertia allows for knowledge to be captured, okay? And in other studies, it discusses that inertia is all bad, okay? Kind of like we had discussed, Dr. Andy, where you had mentioned it's always bad, right? There are some instances, but this is actually interesting that, we can capture both.
Okay, fair enough. So I just want to make sure that the audience understands where you're coming from the standpoint. So in essay 2, you brought up this idea of the change management, and you did not find the moderation influence, right? But then you found a main effect, right,
Yes.
which was negative, correct? It was
Correct.
a negative effect of change management, meaning if you invested in change management or if there's a propensity to change, that is, then it has a negative influence on effectiveness and innovation. So can you explain why that could be the case?
Well, it is the public sector, okay? One of the things that I've seen, and I'll talk about the literature, and I'll also talk about the practice. I'll start with the literature. Kind of what it mentioned in the literature was that, when it comes to doing things for a very long time, right? And some folks are saying that the organization is effective and can lead to innovativeness. Change management is difficult to do. So change is always hard, okay? It's not easy. In practice, I'll tell you that since I've started with the state of Wisconsin, it has been difficult, okay, to try to implement new ideas, to try to understand, why we're doing what we're doing, and even to try to implement new practices, okay? So it's change is just difficult, and it's always going to have a negative notion. It's what it seems like.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. So the last question I have for you is, can you tell us one surprising thing that you found, apart from what you've known from the literature and, your experiences, when you went to that case site and or talked to them, or from the survey data, anything that jumped out and said, I'm surprised by this finding?
Actually, one of the things that did surprise me is that in literature, it talks about that bureaucratic constraints, always talks about bureaucratic constraints, is what actually does not allow for organizations to move forward. I was actually surprised by one of the respondents or one of the participants when he said, no, you have it wrong. You have it actually the other way around. It's the public that makes that demand. Mm-hmm. And then it becomes legislation. So it actually made me think, especially go down the historical road as to what happened with the CARES Act with that organization. Because I didn't quite understand, well, this happened through legislation. What are you talking about? No, actually, weeks before that, the legacy system was not able to provide any more benefits. It wasn't able to store. It wasn't able to distribute. It basically locked down, okay? And when it locked down, that's when the legislation, another legislation came out. The CARES Act basically made the systematic change. The legacy system was not able to perform the changes. New budget is needed for this because there's a public outcry. Mm-hmm. And I believe that in the first week, there were close to 300,000. When the pandemic hit, there were close to 300,000 benefits that people had to do initial claims, and at least 30% of that were actually held back because of the legacy information system.
Okay. All right. Very good. Thanks, Edgard. I pass it on to Adi now.
Yeah, great presentation, Edgard.
Thank you.
So I have one question for you, and that is, when you were interviewing those individuals at the beginning, did any of them talk positively about Inertia?
They did. And that goes back to one of my results where one of them said, look, Edgard is giving us reliable results. What are you talking about, right? And part of their answer was basically that, it's gotten us this far, okay? We have not been penalized. This is what the federal side is okay with, okay? And there is nothing else that we can do on our end to try to make things better. Because at the end of the day, let's say, for example, if we start creating performance metrics, if the federal government is not asking for them, why would we want to shoot ourselves in the foot? Okay? So in those instances, they were saying, why do we want to create new practices here? We don't need to. We've gotten by with what we gotten by, okay? And we'll continue on our trajectory. And actually, as I was discussing with some of the participants, about inertia, like what have you learned? Everybody said the same thing, okay? Which was that through inert practices, they have learned knowledge, okay? Which was actually needed. The issue, though, is that it's not formalized, okay? I think that was the biggest issue that I saw. It was not formalized. But at the very end, they were able to create a culture, okay, that understood that although it's not formalized, this is what we have to do to be effective at this moment.
And then for your SA2, the moderation did not work, right?
Correct.
Do you think if you expanded your, the number of respondents, do you think that would change?
I think it could. I also think that expanding the audience, right? Expanding the target audience would also help. In this study, I believe we had the federal government, the state government, and then we had other public sector agencies. But as we were looking at it and we were analyzing the data, a lot of the things, especially with change management, did not work out. But I think that it would. I think that, especially because I see it day in and day out in practice, where managers want to make changes, right? They want to make changes so that the organizations are effective. They want to make changes so that the organization are innovativeness. So, I do believe I've had a lot of discussions with a lot of different managers and directors, and I do believe that if we expanded it a little bit more, that maybe the results will change.
The third question is not really academic, but based on your experience as a DBA student, what legacy information system that you had issues with would you like to change, given a chance?
Which one I would like to teach?
No, change. So, like a system that
Change. Oh man, I'll save that one. Dr. Praveen is here. I'll save that one.
All right, yeah, that's it. I guess Andy.
Thank you.
All right, Edgard, thank you very much for the presentation.
Thank you.
Obviously, this is something that I find personally quite interesting, personally and professionally. On this topic right here, I guess it's a kind of a two-part question that I've got. So you've kind of alluded to the different type of directors out there and the discussions that you've had, but at your current employer, this may be within your own division or within DWD, do you have in mind who might benefit most from the findings of your research?
I do.
Okay, and so I guess the question I have for that is have you communicated these results to them yet, or?
It's in process.
Oh, okay, because I'd say if you had communicated it, I'd be curious of how you communicated it,
Yeah.
and if you haven't, or if it's in
Yeah.
process, how might you share these results to them so that it would not just lie there, it's something that
Yeah.
actually benefits from this?
Exactly. I have been really lucky enough where my management team, we travel throughout the whole state of Wisconsin every quarter. And when we travel every quarter, we're always discussing how we can change our operations, okay? Internally, with no funding. Sometimes it requires, like we've talked about, spreadsheets or something to that effect, right? Well, I've seen it firsthand that maybe a lot of managers disengage with the communication because they're just tired of it leading nowhere. So when I say in process is to try to figure out who I need to talk to, okay? Because everybody seems to be kind of in a place where they are complacent. And, I continue to hear the same thing. Edgard, it's been tried before. Edgard, it's not going to work. We need this legislation to pass. We need a public cry to happen. But in reality, I think that communication is missing. Communication with the right folks that understand the information systems, that are able to, like myself, right, bring something to the table and say, hey, by the way, have you noticed? When I found out that they had systems around for almost 50 years, a lot has happened in 50 years, okay? A lot. So to hear that a pandemic was the way that they adopted technology was actually really surprising to me, because that's not logical, right? You knew for a very long time that you needed to modernize. But it wasn't until everything hit the fan that you understood that you really needed to, okay? Which is I think that's a problematic approach. I think that when looking at that approach, it's just not sustainable, okay? And actually, I know a lot more information about this just because I'm part of the state And I understood that it probably would have costed a third of the cost if they were proactive. Okay?
All right, thank you. That's all for my questions. Maybe
Thank
I'll
you.
just leave it open to the audience or maybe
Yeah,
other
yeah.
committee members.
Any questions from the audience? Oh, okay. No questions from the family? Or, no? All right, great.
They'll be grounded. No, I'm just kidding.
This is your last chance. No. All right. Thank you. Thanks for the questions. And thank you. Thanks for the presentation.
Thank you. Thank you.